Hey there, everyone. Today we're tackling the fourth commandment. So this is the video and the worksheet you'll need to complete for the 27th of October, since we will have the 20th off. So we're tackling your parents' favorite commandment, the fourth commandment. Before we jump into that, though, we've got to start with some jokes. Of course, we've got to have some puns, since those are my favorite. Police were called to a daycare where a 3-year-old was resisting arrest. Did you hear about the fellow whose whole left side was cut off? He's all right now. If you take a laptop computer for a run, you could jog your memory. A bicycle can't stand alone. It is too tired. In a democracy, it's your vote that counts. In feudalism, it's your count that votes. That one might require you to do some research on the internet. This goes back to medieval days when we had kings and queens and counts. Anyway, the other joke for today is, while driving in Pennsylvania, a family caught up to an Amish carriage. The owner of the carriage obviously had a sense of humor, because attached to the back of the carriage was a hand-printed sign: energy-efficient vehicle, runs on oats and grass. Caution, do not step in the exhaust. And what I just heard today, maybe you've heard this one before. You have to be a fan of the Flintstones, so parents, you may need to educate your kids on this one, but hopefully your parents will get it. So, did you hear about the difference between the people who live in Dubai and the people who live in Abu Dhabi? Now, these are cities in the Far East and in the Middle East. So, well, anyway, the people in Dubai do not like the Flintstones. The people in Abu Dhabi do. Anyway, okay, there you go. Enough comedy jokes. Let's jump into a commandment that honestly, over the last 2 years has been all over the news and continues to be in so many ways. So I'm sure we'll have some really, really interesting conversations. I hope you have some interesting conversations about this at home, because it's something that we are being forced to deal with in many different ways. And unfortunately, as Christians and as the Christian church, as our culture and sadly our government is choosing to follow a way that's not only absent of Christian values, but is actually against or antagonistic with Christian values. This will be something that we'll be struggling with, kids, probably for most of your lifetime. Things have changed a lot since I was your age. So anyway, let's get into it. Fourth commandment: honor your father and mother. What does this mean? We are to fear and love God so that we do not despise or anger our parents and other authorities, but honor them, serve and obey them, love and cherish them. So here are some questions. I'm just going to put these on the screen, and then what I want you to do is pause your video and talk about these as a family. And then when you get back, we can continue on with it. All right, hopefully you had some good discussions there and you learned a little bit. Now I hope you continue to learn a little bit more. Ultimately, why are we concerned about the authorities in our life and the world? It's because all authority ultimately comes from God. He chooses to exercise that authority through means, through entities, through people, through institutions. We could have a whole nother discussion about how God rules through the government and also how God rules through the church in very different ways, but that's a different discussion. Right now we're dealing with kind of the authority that God gives to parents and governments and so on. So what are some other authorities? Romans 13:11 shows us that governments are authorities instituted by God, that teachers are authorities. Now, one thing it's important to realize, and I think through COVID and especially with the school shutdowns, is something that's been a big reminder for me, is that the foundation of all society, really organizationally speaking, from God's standpoint, is really the nuclear family. That everything leads out from mother, father, children. So, in other words, government exists by God's decree to assist parents, to keep society safe and in bounds and in control. We talked about the three uses of the law. This would be the first use of the law, to curb. So the government uses power, uses might to control things, but they do it to assist, again, parents. The authority, they're really, well, anyway, let's continue. Teachers. The scripture is pretty clear that parents are the ones ultimately responsible for teaching their children, especially the faith, and that schools, teachers, are intended to come alongside and assist parents in their responsibility. I think parents, when we were going through the lockdown, were in many ways reminded of that responsibility, as they were often the ones at home making sure, responsible, that things were getting done. And then there's all kinds of things that are being taught in the schools today, I think, where parents are beginning to sort of wake up a little bit and be reminded again of their responsibility and how they are to hold accountable schools. Government, same way. Some other authorities, here's one of my favorites. The Hebrews verse here talks about leaders. This is within the church, so you can say pastors, elders, right? Respect, honor. And then finally, bosses. Students, if you don't have one, you will soon, and you're to honor them as well. So all of these are considered authority, or authorities that are instituted by God. Now, what does God forbid in the fourth commandment? Well, he forbids that we don't show respect to those in authority. Whether we agree with them or not is one thing, but we're always called to honor that position, that authority, because it's ultimately God's authority. And so we are, in honoring those who are in authority over us, we're ultimately honoring God. So if we don't respect those in authority, then we are not respecting God. Again, whether you like them or not, we're not to anger them. This kind of goes in the, we'll talk about this in a minute, where there are promises that come with this one, that you'll lead a long and happy life. Well, yeah, if you're not angering those in authority over you, your life will probably go a little bit better. And then being disobedient to those in authority, we're called to, this is what we're told not to do. So what does God require of us? What are the positive things that we are to do? And this is Luther's explanation is so helpful here, right? To honor those in authority, to gladly provide those in authority with what they need to do their job, and then obeying those in authority, and then love and to cherish them. And this could take all kinds of different forms. You're not going to show the same kind of love and cherish to your teacher at school that you would to your mom and dad. And then showing respect to those who are older than us. I know that's tough students sometimes. And we all struggle with this in different ways, but we're still called to do it. Now, I mentioned this already, but in Ephesians 6:1-4, Paul writes, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise," and that promise is that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So God promises that we'll have a long and good life. And this should be obvious, that if we do what those over us ask us to do, and we'll get to this in a minute, as long as it's in accord with God's will, then life will, in general, not always, but it will, in general, go better. If you don't speed, you don't get a ticket. And if you don't get a ticket, then you have more money in your bank account for other things. Acts 5:29 says, "But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" And this is where I think this has been a hot topic within the Christian community and churches. I'm thinking of two different situations, and parents, we may need to find time to kind of talk about this a little bit more. But I'm thinking of the riots, especially in Minneapolis after George Floyd. Looking at protests that are God-pleasing, and there are times when, and there are ways in which you can protest that is God-pleasing when you see the government in the wrong. But then also you have all the stuff that's come out with COVID, and how do we balance following this government authorities' requests and demands and orders, and when do we decide it's time to not do that? So this is the question that comes at: when may we have to refuse to obey those in authority? Well, it doesn't have to do with American freedoms. God is not talking about that. God is not talking about a decision that you think is stupid on the government's part. Where the church, where we as Christians draw the line in terms of when do we disobey, is it's when something is against God's will. And honestly, as far as COVID goes, and again, we can talk more about this, there's nothing in Scripture that says that masks are against God's will. So that's left for people to wrestle, and not a place for the church to step in. Social distancing is the same way. Vaccines, for the most part, is not something that the church is going to come out and speak against. That's really not kind of the place for, God hasn't come out and stated that. Now, some places, one place in particular that is, and I think it is right for the government or for the church to come out and speak against, is in the context of some of the abortion laws and the taxing that's where the government will use our tax dollars to fund abortions. That's a place where the church, I think, does have a responsibility, and Christians do, to come out and speak against, to disobey, if it comes to that. Another one, going back to COVID, is, third commandment, we just got done with that, is that we are to remember the Sabbath day and keeping it holy, and that includes worship. So what does that look like in the context of COVID? We as a church shut down. Initially, I think in good faith, but I think we saw plenty of examples where the government sort of began to treat churches differently, or that that demand or request to not gather became put Christians to a point where they were having to disobey God's command for weekly worship. Again, there's some big ideas here, and some very pertinent ones in our lives today. And hopefully you will have a chance to talk about it as a family, in class and in parent time. Hopefully we can continue this conversation. Yeah. So, well, like I said, there's just so many things we could talk about here. And we'll leave that for in-person conversation. So what should you do when there is an abuse of authority? I think there are times where protests are, and our government allows for this, but there's a way in which protests can be, you can find yourself protesting and breaking other commandments, destruction of property, hurting other people, those sorts of things. There's a way within, and I'm thankful, in our country, there are times and places, there is a right way and an acceptable way, even according to the government, to speak out against government abuses, because we all know in a fallen world, government and those in authority do abuse that. And so there is a time and place for that. Something else, and I just heard this on a podcast today, and parents, it was excellent, speaking about this from a professor I had at the seminary. I think there are times where we as Christians are called to disobey authority, but I think that in doing so, we still are called to submit to or honor that authority. And so that may mean that, okay, I'm not going to do this because of an explicit thing that the government is causing us to do that is asking us to do that would cause us to sin. That I will break the law, be disobedient to government, but I can't complain then. We must willingly submit to whatever punishment then this God given authority is placing on us. So if I refuse to do A, then when the government says, okay, you're going to go to jail for this or whatever, then I can't cry foul because I'm still submitting to the authority. Again, this gets really complicated. So just continuing on, Jesus did follow this commandment. We know that in these texts that you see here, that he was obedient to his parents. And then also, when he was asked about government taxes, he said, in a sense, he said, submit, again, to government authorities. Now, this rest part here, I hope you guys will spend some time talking about. I found this very interesting and helpful in terms of, as students, as you grow up, how your relationship changes with your parents and what that looks like. Here are some verses. Again, please pause, read these, talk about them a little bit. If you have any questions, please let me know. But there was something very helpful that was shared, and I thought I'd want to share it with you. And it's how we, as we grow, we move from dependence to independence in our relationship with our parents. And that's a difficult thing. Parents, I'm sure even for you today, as you, as you're now adults, maybe you're find yourself in a position where you're having to assist your parents, and find very difficult and awkward that is as a parent, as a child, almost in a way acting as a parent to older adults, our parents as they get older. I know I was in that situation before my parents passed. And it's difficult, students. It's difficult for you, and it's difficult for your parents too. So I think for both sides we need a lot of grace. Okay. So moving from dependence to independence, here are the stages that this Dr. Erik Erikson, there's a name for you, came up with. I think it's helpful. So from ages 0 to 1.5, complete trust, unquestioning, unwavering trust in parents. And then we have this discovery where then the key relationship becomes others in the household, siblings. Age 3 to 5, then it broadens to the family in general. Again, still very isolated in the household. 6 to 11, we're getting into school now. Then all of a sudden, peers become a bigger part of our lives. 12 to 18, then friends. This is kind of where you're at right now. It's about your friends, right? That those are key relationships for you now. And this is why, students, your parents are concerned about who your friends are. And then as we move into adulthood, then the key relationship, God willing, is that of a partner, a husband or a wife, boyfriend, girlfriend. And you know, in each of these stages, it's a time of change. It's you're continuing to grow, these relationships with our parents change. My children are 22 and 24 now. One of them is married. One of them is not. The one who is not, because of COVID, has been with us while she's been attending school at the University of Minnesota, and for the most part it's gone well, but it is a struggle. Parents, remember when you went off to college, if you did, and you would come home for the summers with your parents and how difficult those times were. Again, we've been through all of these. Students, your parents went through these at your age as well. So this isn't something, there's nuances. There are things that are different for you than it was for them, but many of these struggles are universal and will never change. Okay. So a good parable to think about in terms of authority is the parable of the Prodigal Son. And I'll have you read this. So if you want to pause it, or I'll just give you some time here. Don't pause it. Okay. A couple things just to note with this. That's important to remember, that usually we receive an inheritance from our parents after they're deceased. That's important to think about because in Jesus' day there was a stronger expectation in terms of respect of parental authority. So when this son goes to his father and says, "Give me the share of property that is coming to me," A, it was an insult to even ask for this, and B, he was in a sense wishing his father dead, or in a sense treating his father as if he were dead. So the father gives him the inheritance, and he goes off and he wastes it. He just blows it, and he ends up in a horrible where he's getting paid to feed pigs, and he's so hungry that the slop that he's feeding the pigs looks good to him. Now, in a culture for the Israelites where pigs were something to avoid, you didn't eat, you didn't touch, nothing, it makes it extra worse. And at this point, he's so desperate, he says, "You know what, even the servants in my father's household are living better than me. I will go back." And he had this big plan. He was going to apologize. He says, he was planning to tell Dad, "Don't even treat me as a son. Just treat me as a servant. That's fine." The father, though, as you see read here, he saw his son from a long way off. And again, something that an adult would never do in Jesus' day would be to run. That would be undignified. That would be embarrassing. But yet he did it because he was thrilled that his son was coming back to him, and he embraced him, he kissed him. There's another part of this story where the son has another brother who does what Dad asks, sticks around and does everything. And after this, the dad says, "Okay, we're going to throw a party because my son came back." Well, the other son gets kind of ticked. He said, "Dad, I've been here, I've done everything you asked, and you never threw me a party. But now, because this Yahoo, this younger brother of mine, comes back after blowing all this money, after disrespecting you, after wishing you were dead, you're going to throw him a party?" And so he's actually angry obviously at his brother, but actually angry at his father for showing grace to his son, forgiving his son. So then the question is, and when we see these parables, we always have to ask the question, right? A parable is a earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Well, who does the son represent? Well, the son, and you can say in some ways, both sons represent us. And the Father, of course, is our heavenly Father. And the message is that all of us have disrespected, have turned away from God, have been angry with God in showing grace for others, but our Father is the one who not only runs to us, who becomes one of us, and then willingly dies for us and rises again so that we could be with him. Another passage says that the heaven rejoices over one sinner repenting. A neat story again of in terms of the relationship of authority, of a father, a son, of parents and children, and ultimately of our heavenly Father and us. Because we do break this commandment. We break it in our earthly relationships, and we break it in our relationship with God. Which reminds me, just to mark the shift now, the first 3 commandments, right, has to do with loving God. Now we've shifted, and the focus now is in our relationship with others. So now we're in the context of loving our neighbor. And the first neighbor is the one that in many ways closest to us, right? Mom and dad and children in that relationship. Okay. So here's some things again to think about, some better ways, kids, for you to relate to your parents. Talk with them. I know it can be difficult, it can be awkward, but think of something that you can talk with your parents about. And we'll take some time in class to brainstorm this a little bit. Listen to your parents. Again, might be difficult. Think about, why is it you don't want to listen to them? When is it that you're most unwilling to listen to your parents? From a parent standpoint, parents, I'm speaking from experience, sometimes we have to realize that there are better times, better ways to talk with our children. So just something for you to think about as well. Hey, students, maybe offer to help your parents. You'd be shocked at how many points you can score, bonus points you can score with mom and dad if you offer to help. It'll do wonders to improve your relationship with them. By the way, if you do this after you get in trouble, your parents will see through it a lot quicker. And then don't be afraid to ask your parents for the help. This is what parents thrive on, what they want to do. And maybe stop and think, maybe your initial thought is, oh, they can't help me, they don't understand. Well, A, they probably understand a whole lot better than you think, and B, help them understand. You have nobody more willing and able to help you than your parents. Use it. Okay. That's it. A little bit shorter, hopefully, this time around. 4th commandment, like I said, I'm sure this will lead to a whole lot of discussion. I'm looking forward to it, and we'll see you next time.